A well-liked family in rural Germany goes missing. But it turns out they were actually near their home all along. But after their bodies were found, many more surprises would reveal themselves. We're telling that story tonight.
What you are about to hear is believed to be real. Based on witness accounts, testimonies, and public record. This is terrifying and true.
Tonight, we take a look at a particularly interesting and gruesome case from Germany that has remained unsolved since 1922. It's a case that is so baffling that it had investigators at the time and even to this day unsure as to what exactly took place. But like many unsolved cases, it is that uncertainty that attracts attention. After all, how exactly does a family of 5 plus their maid die in such a brutal manner, then to be displayed in a gruesome manner? And what about the case has left police stumped for 102 years? This is the case of the murders at the Hinterkaifeck farm. Right after these quick words. Unsolved cases remain a topic of extreme curiosity in the public eye. While anything related to crime is always going to garner interest, those that go without any resolution have a tendency to spark the imagination and hook people in, more so. In the United States alone, there are well over 200,000 cases, with close to 6,000 being added every year, that are labeled unsolved. But what about the rest of the world? With podcasts and online journalism growing more and more every year, those that live in the United States and other countries in general have the ability to learn about new crimes that either are or are not solved. On the afternoon of March 31st, 1922, Maria Baumgartner arrived at the Hinterkaifeck farm to act as a maid. She was to work for the family of Andreas Gruber, 63, Kazelia Gruber, 72, Victoria Gabriel, 35, Kazelia Gabriel, 7, and Joseph Gabriel, just 2 years old. On April 1st, coffee-selling brothers Hans and Edward Skarovsky arrived at Hinterkaifeck to take the family's order. Upon arriving, they found nobody present to answer their knocks on the doors and windows. The brothers walked around the property and found nobody, only noticing that the gate to the machine house was open. Finding the family absent, they left the farm. Kazelia Gabriel was noted as having missed school for the next few days with no reason given. Along with this, the entire family was absent from Sunday worship services. On April 4th, assembler Albert Hoffner went to Hinterkaifeck to do repair work on an engine. Hoffner would later say that while at the property, he saw nobody, and that the only sounds he heard were of the farm animals and the family dog. The worker waited for an hour until he decided to go ahead and start the repairs on the engine. 4.5 hours later, Hoffner left the farm with his job complete. Noticing the family's absence and hearing about the few people to try and find them there to no avail, Lorenz Schlittenbauer sent his sons Jonah and Joseph to visit the farm and see if they could make contact with the family or gain any insight on where they might have gone off to. When they returned later that day and reported they had found nothing, Lorenz went to Hinterkaifeck himself, accompanied by Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigel. Once at the farm, the trio went into the barn and discovered the bodies of Andrea Gruber, Kazelia Gruber, Victoria Gabriel, and the younger Kazelia, Horrified, the group then checked in the house, where they discovered the bodies of Maria Baumgartner and Joseph Gabriel. As they and the authorities would later report, the bodies in the barn were stacked on top of one another and were covered with hay. Once the police arrived at Hinterkaifeck, the investigation was underway and several facts became certain about the grisly crime. While the murder weapon was never found, court physician Johann Baptist Müller was able to deduce that the weapon was more than likely a mattock. A mattock is an agricultural tool shaped like a pickaxe, with an adze and a chisel edge as the ends of the head. Other evidence at the scene was able to show that the younger Kazelia lived for several hours after the attack and had ripped hair out of her head while laying in the hay. The police later sent the skulls of the victims off to Munich for further examination. Initially, the authorities believed the motive for the crime was to rob the family. Due to this, they had interrogated several groups of traveling craftsmen, vagrants, residents of nearby villages, and any other persons that would have been moving through the area. However, after finding a large sum of money in the house, the police abandoned this idea. Adding to the decision to let go of the robbery theory was the fact that someone had fed the cattle in the time after the murders and before the discovery of the bodies. There was also evidence that whoever had done the deed had eaten the entire supply of bread from the kitchen and had recently cut meat from the pantry. With these facts in mind, authorities were able to put together the theory that whoever committed the murders had stayed on the property for some considerable time before moving on. Unfortunately, despite multiple arrests and suspects, the police were unable to determine a motive for the murders, and with no leads on the case, authorities, seeing no other options at the time, reluctantly halted their investigation. In 1956, the files for the murders were officially closed. The last time officials took a look at the case and attempted to put it to rest was in 1986, before Detective Chief Superintendent Konrad Müller retired. From the time the murders were being investigated to the present day, there have been several theories as to what happened and who did the gruesome and unspeakable deed. Initially, it was believed by the police that those who were found in the barn were drawn there by their animals being restless and making loud noises. However, after attempting to recreate the events, authorities came to the conclusion that not even the screams of a human could be heard from inside the house, let alone the animals, thus putting an end to that theory. According to an artisan named Michael Plockel, he was passing by Hinterkaifeck the night after the murders had taken place and noted that the oven had been heated up by somebody and that there was a foul odor emanating from the smoke that came out of the stove. Having been noticed, that person approached Plockel and blinded him with a lantern before running off. Investigators never followed up with Plockel or determined what had been burned in the oven. Later on, another report was made by a neighbor of the area, Simon Reislander, that on April 1st at around 3 a.m, he was on his way home near Brunnen when he came across 2 strangers. When the strangers noticed Reislander, they covered their faces and headed into the forest. After Reislander heard of the murders, he thought immediately of those 2 masked strangers. While the investigation was ongoing, several strange facts about the farm came to light. 6 months prior to the murders, the maid the family employed at the time suddenly quit after claiming to have heard strange noises from the attic, and stated that she believed the house to be haunted. There was also an instance in March of 1922 when Andreas found a Munich newspaper on the property but could not remember buying it. Additionally, in relation to that was the fact that no one in the area was subscribed to that particular paper. Shortly before the murders, Andreas told various neighbors that he had discovered tracks that when followed went from the forest to a door for the farm's machine room, where there was a broken lock. Later that same night, the family heard footsteps coming from the attic. When Andreas went to investigate, he found nobody there, and after continuing his search to the whole building, once more, he found no one. According to a school friend of the 7-year-old Kazelia, it was reported that her mother Victoria had fled the farm the night before the act after a violent quarrel, and only hours later had been found in the forest. In regards to the suspects authorities interviewed and even arrested, there were several people whom they believed were responsible for the crime or, at the very least, knew who the murderer was. But all of those were left to be simply theories. The most accepted one is that Lorenz Schlittenbauer was the killer. Community gossip suggested that after his wife died in 1918, he began a relationship with Victoria Gabriel, and that it was he who fathered Joseph, though others rumored that Joseph was a product of rape or an incestuous relationship between Victoria and her father. Aside from the rumors of his relationship with Victoria, he garnered suspicions due to some of his actions after the murders took place. When Schlittenbauer and his friends arrived to investigate, they had to break a gate to enter the barn because all of the doors were locked. However, immediately after finding the 4 bodies in the barn, Schlittenbauer apparently unlocked the front door with a key and entered the house alone. While it is reasonable that as their neighbor and potentially Victoria's lover, he would have a key, it was known that the family had lost a key about a week before the murders took place. When asked by his companions why he had gone into the house alone when it was unclear if the murderer might still be there, Schlittenbauer allegedly stated that he went to look for his son Joseph. It is known that Schlittenbauer had disturbed the bodies at the scene, thus potentially compromising the investigation. For years after the murders, suspicion remained on Schlittenbauer, and before his death in 1941, Schlittenbauer conducted and won several civil claims for slander against persons who described him as, quote, murderer of Hinterkaifeck. Other theories include a wild speculation that Victoria's dead husband, Carl Gabriel, was responsible, citing that he never really died in World War I, returned to Germany, and committed the murders. Multiple theories even suggest that it was 2 people who committed the crime. Although generally speaking, most people have leaned into the idea that Lorenz Schlittenbauer had committed the heinous act. Like many things from over 100 years ago, there are elements lost to time in regards to the Hinterkaifeck farm. However, like modern-day unsolved mysteries, people find themselves fascinated by the crime and spark debate and independent investigations to see if they can figure out the bloody affair. In 2007, 15 students of the police academy in Fürstenfeldbruck examined the case using modern criminal investigation techniques. In their final report, in German, they confirmed the meticulousness of the investigation at the time, but criticized the lack of professional forensics. In particular, the failure to take fingerprints was criticized, as this was already common practice at the time. Although it is almost certain that the murderer can no longer be identified, all authors of the report independently agreed on who the main suspect in the case was. However, his name was not mentioned out of consideration for his descendants. Whether the crime is solved in the future is up for debate. What isn't up for debate, though, is that it will continue to attract attention both in its native Germany as well as around the world. But until the day comes that it is possibly solved, the Hinterkaifeck farm murders will remain an unsolved mystery of a remarkable vintage. What do you think? Do you have any thoughts on who committed the Hinterkaifeck farm murders? Send us your thoughts at weeklyspooky@gmail.com, and we'll get right back to you. Also, if you have an unsolved mystery or a particularly fascinating crime you'd like us to deep dive into, send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. And as always, after listening to something grotesque and gruesome and sad, take a deep breath, tell someone you love them, and appreciate every day you're gifted, because tomorrow is never promised, but hopefully it'll be waiting for us. Terrifying and True is narrated by Enrique Couto. This episode is written by Morgan Moore. It's executive produced by Rob Fields and Mark Shields. Produced by Daniel Wilder with original theme music by Ray Mattis. If you have a story you'd like us to cover on the program, send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. And if you want to support us in a very direct way, go to weeklyspooky.com and click on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can support us and allow us to keep the spooky rolling and rolling and rolling. And I want to say a big thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay just a little bit more to hear their names at the end of the show. And they are Johnny Nix, John Kalin, Bobbletopia.com, Jenny Green, Brent McCullough, Karen Weemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time right here on Weekly Spooky and Terrifying and True.